Well, good afternoon, Dr. Maya. I guess so far you're the only one on here except for me. Hopefully some of the other students will join. I've seen a few people register and other students have registered, so I'm not quite sure why or where they are yet. It's 10 minutes into the time, but hopefully they will go ahead and join us, and if not, then they can always watch the recording later on. This afternoon's topic is an APA session on preparing for that final paper, and we've all had these kinds of final papers in the past. Even those of us who are faculty members have had that final paper in the past that sort of gave us a little bit of anxiety about what exactly we need to do a good job, and wondering what our professor was expecting of us to do a good job, and how do we meet all of those different expectations. So what I'm hoping to do with today's session is to go through some tips. Some are APA oriented and some are not, just in terms of helping people understand what they can do to better prepare themselves for getting that final paper ready and getting the best grade and the most learning they can out of it as possible. So Dr. Swanson, I think it was her idea to have me do 5 tips. So what I've tried to do is organize all of the different ideas that I had going around in my head about this stuff into 5 areas. So as a typical academic would, I came up with a model, and I presented it here in today's agenda. And I'm calling this the, how would we say this, the PLOS model? The PLOKI or the PLOS model? I don't know. But I was trying to come up with some sort of an acronym to help everyone remember exactly what they could do for these 5 tips. And those 5 tips, in order, are plan, layout, organize, cite, and edit. So what I'm going to do in this session is go through each of those 5 tips, and we'll talk about what's included in each one of those, and then at the end we're going to go through some examples about editing and have some discussion at the end about what we can do to make our papers as successful as possible. And this is an important time of year for students in more traditional settings, but of course for our students at Ashford, they have final papers due all the time, maybe every 5 or 6 weeks possibly. So hopefully the session will be timely for everyone, including people in other universities who are approaching that time of the year in the spring semester when it becomes time to write their last paper of the term. So the first step in my model is to plan. And planning, I think, in my opinion, can start as soon as you know what the assignment is, whatever the paper is, because this is something that sort of needs to be going through your head throughout the class, so that even on the first day, if it's in the syllabus or in your list of assignments that you need to write a paper for this class, think about it throughout the course. Pay attention to what your professor talks about, what seems important to your instructor. Understanding your professor and what they want will hopefully become clear to you throughout the class to see where their important points are and what's important for you to focus on to them. So understanding their expectations is kind of the first step to make sure that you're clear on what they will want. And that's a question that I get frequently from students is, well, what do you want? And that kind of question is a little bit difficult for me because of the fact that it's really hard to tell students what I want, because what I want is to help them think and to help them learn and to have that thinking and learning reflected in their writing. So instead of focusing so much on exactly what the professor wants, put the learning into it first, and then my belief is that if you put the learning and the effort into it, then the outcome, the final project, the final paper will sort of follow in the end. But aside from that, sometimes your professor will give you certain expectations that will be outlined for you. So they've written the assignment up for you, and you have it. Read it as carefully as you can. Make sure you haven't missed any points that they want to make sure that you include in your assignment. If there's a rubric available, look for that. I see this a lot in my classes when there is a rubric available for the final paper, as there is in my research methods course that I teach frequently at Ashford. And it says very, very specifically how many points you're going to be assigned to what parts of the paper. I post in class over and over again. I pointed out, and sometimes students still miss some of those points from a rubric, and they lose a lot of credit because they have missed on some of those points. So see if that's available and make sure that you follow that closely. Paying attention to pointers or things that are announced in class. I post announcements, making sure that they've seen the rubric, ideas that I have for a proposed structure for a paper, or things that they say are important. Once that's in class, make sure that you're reading all of those tips, because that will definitely help you in the end. And you need to ask questions sometimes. If you're not clear on something, if you just need some clarification, don't be afraid to ask. But the problem is that sometimes we need to learn a little bit about the assignment before we can ask. So that's why if you plan, you can know what you need to ask in advance. So do this before the due date so that if you have a question the day the assignment is due, you may or may not be able to get your questions answered because your professor might not be available on the very day that it's due. And before it's graded, sometimes I'll see students come in after they've submitted an assignment or after they've gotten their comments back, and they'll say, well, I didn't understand this part. Well, I can help you before it's due, but I can't help you after it's due or after it's graded because it's already been done and submitted. If you have emergencies like that, remember that they're not your professor's emergency, so be aware of what their deadlines are, be aware of what their policies are, their expectations for late work if you have something come up at the last minute. So whether it's an emergency that prevents you from turning in your final paper on time, or if it's an emergency that at the very last minute you realize that you missed out on some sort of detail or you had a question, if you're emailing them at 5 p.m. and the assignment is due on midnight that day, don't necessarily expect that they can answer your question at the last minute. But that all said, we are here to help you succeed. That's why we're here. We don't want to see students fail. But the students, you guys, as students, you need to do a little bit of that work on your side of it to make sure that we can help you the best way you can. And for us to help you, you need to do some of that planning in advance, to think about your timing, to think about how much time you're really going to need to do this paper, and to make sure that you're not scrambling to get your questions answered at the last minute. So all of that work can be done even before you start writing the paper. So again, help is available. Don't be afraid to ask for help. There's a lot of different places that you can get help, not just from your professor. But you need to be thinking about these things in advance, as I've already said. Start writing ideas down on your head and in paper. But I work a lot in my head. Not everybody works this way, but I do a lot of work in my head in advance before I start writing things down at strange times when I'm traveling somewhere, when I'm in the shower. Sometimes when I'm walking the dogs in the morning, I'll get things in my head going on, and so different people have different approaches for this. But try some different things to see what works for you. If it helps you to write stuff down just on a piece of paper, do that. Some people like to write outlines. I know when I was in high school and younger, I was taught a very strict method of outlining. I always had to turn in an outline before I turned in my paper in my English classes. But outlining didn't really help for me. I thought it was a little bit too structured, but some people can think that way a little bit more easily. So just try to find what works for you. Do some searching for literature and reading in advance as well, so that you can get some background information on your paper topic. And generally, a lot of times, we do a lot of reading and searching and finding things that we don't even necessarily end up citing in our final paper, but we need a lot of that background information. So that can take some time. So again, that's part of your planning process, is to get the background information that you need, try to figure out exactly which you'll be using in your paper, what was helpful, but not necessarily worth citing and so on. But give yourself some time to do that. When you're writing, remember another reason to not to wait until the last minute is because your first draft should not necessarily be your last draft. And I say that because sometimes, frequently, we don't always do our best writing on our first try, because on our first try, we're just trying to get all of our ideas out and sort them out, and so it doesn't always come out very well organized. Sometimes it's not written as clearly as it could be, so we need to do a lot of this kind of work in advance. And consult the Writing Center. In Ashford, we have the Ashford Writing Center, which is online, and they have a lot of good tips that are just posted online for you. You don't even need to ask anybody. Or a librarian. Again, at Ashford, we have online librarians that are available for certain hours for online chat and phone and email consultation. But you need to know what you're asking. And I say this, my background is, one of the things I've done in my background is I am a certified librarian, if you can say that. I have a master's and a PhD in information science, and that's my background. So here's a comic strip from what's called Unshelved. It's a comic strip about libraries and librarians. So this is a typical thing that we might find when people don't know what they want. So the patron comes in and says, I need you to look up something. The patron says, can you be more specific? Not really. Then let me get today's designated non-specific problem solver. I've got a Tyvek suit, salad tongs, and the Old Farmer's Almanac. What seems to be the problem? So we try to be as prepared as possible, but it's difficult to do if we don't know what the problem is. And we sort of have these standard jokes about, well, I had a book I liked and it was blue, and I need to find the blue book again. Well, we need some information about what your topic is or whatever, so the librarians can help you direct you to the right kinds of literature, but once again, you need to have an idea of what your topic is. So that is all part of planning, is making sure that you know what you need to do for your paper, start getting those ideas together, and then you can ask for help more carefully once you know a little bit about where you need to get started. This is what you want to avoid. If you plan and you draft and you do all those things in advance, you won't be stuck on the last day of class with an open Word document with nothing in it. And I think that this is always one of the most difficult parts of getting started with any sort of big paper is you see the blank screen in front of you, or what used to be a blank piece of paper in front of you. And you don't want this. You're going to have a blank page at some point, but make it earlier on, well before the assignment is due, so that you don't see this in the last day, because we all know from experience, we've all had experiences like this at one time or another when we didn't plan as well as we could have, and we're stuck with that blank page at the last minute and kind of create some panic, and we want to try to avoid that. So let's not do that and wait until the end and be faced with this in front of our computers. So the next step of the model is laying out, and this is where it gets more specific to APA. These are resources that are available from the Ashford Writing Center's website, and that's where I took these from. So we need to have, for starters, a cover page, and we have those elements that are listed there on this example. The course, this course information, some of this is specific to Ashford, the course instructor's name and date, but this is not all standard throughout APA. So if you are a part of a different university and you have different requirements, APA doesn't require these, so make sure that you know what's important for your particular university. And we see that we have a header at the top of the page that has sort of the first few words of the title of your paper. That needs to be at the top of the header, and the information on the page is centered both on the page and vertically and horizontally, and the margins are 1 inch throughout the entire paper. So we see a lot of variations on this. Sometimes students don't get all these different elements correct in their papers, and if your professor is really strict on APA formatting, then you might lose points if you don't have these things set up correctly, because your professor might see that you didn't follow these guidelines carefully. Again, with more on layout, here's an example of the first page of the same paper, and it talks about having double spacing throughout. So double space your entire paper. The only exception to this is block quotes, block quotations. I'll talk about that in a minute. And make sure that you have indented each paragraph, and you can set this up in the page layout tab to make sure that you're tabbing over at the beginning of each paragraph. One thing I see frequently is that the paper is double spaced, but that it's almost like triple spaced between paragraphs, because Word has an option to add extra space between each paragraph, and I think that's on by default. So you'll want to turn that off. It's under the paragraph settings within Word, so that you don't have extra spaces between paragraphs. You start the first page with the title of your paper centered at the top, and you have the heading changes. So if you look at the cover page and the first page, you'll see in the first page it says Running Head, Internet and Distance Ed. And then on the second page and every page after that, all it says is Internet and Distance Ed. So it's called sort of a shortened version of your paper title that needs to appear on every page, as well as the page number over on the right-hand side. And the font specification is usually 12-point Times New Roman. So those are all things to make it look more professional and consistent for your professor. So again, double space everything, even the references. Sometimes I'll see students will double space if they don't double space within the references. Make sure the text is all left aligned. So as you'll see on the example, it's lined specifically on the left-hand side, but the right-hand side is not lined up. Indent by 1/2 inch, and you can set your tab for that. For spacing, you have 1 space after commas, colons, semicolons, periods within your reference citation. So that's like when you have your authors list and you put their initials in the reference list. So a lot of times we'll see students that will put the entire first and middle names of the authors if they're provided. You only need to use initials, and you put the period and then 1 space after the period. After periods at end of sentence, they recommend 2 spaces. In some cases, 1 space is okay, but officially APA says 2 spaces. I tend to use 1. It's just kind of a style issue for me. And be sure to label tables and figures or charts or graphs or any visuals that you have put into your paper. They need to be labeled, and they also need to be mentioned in the text. so that you have table 2, table 1, table 3, whatever number it is. So the first one is table 1 in your paper, the second one is table 2. And you need to mention it within your paragraph. So you can say, please see table 2, reasons why APA formatting is useful, below. And then table 2 will be there. Same with figures. So tables are just anything that look like, regular tabular things that are sort of like, almost like little charts with rows and columns, almost like an Excel spreadsheet sort of looking thing. And figures are anything else. So things like bar graphs or charts or things like that, those are figures. And they need to be labeled correctly each way. So the next step is organize. And when I say organize, it can mean a lot of different things. Some of this is APA, some of it is not. One is to make sure that you follow the length requirements of your professors. If the professor says it needs to be between 5 and 7 pages, excluding your references, make sure to follow that. That's pretty straightforward, and follow the guidelines correctly, because they might take off points for being too short or too long, depending on what's important to them. APA requires sort of medium-length paragraphs for readability. And this is an important point because frequently I see a lot of papers that have very long paragraphs that are sometimes take up 1 page or more. And it's hard to read that way because then you have all of your thoughts sort of put together in 1 paragraph, and it makes it harder to read that way. So make sure to chop up your paragraphs so that they're not too short, but that they're not so long at the same time that you've got a lot of different ideas and points going on in the same paragraph. So visually it makes it easier to read. Make sure your points are presented logically, and this is an important thing to do as you're developing the arguments that you're discussing in your paper. Make sure that you're following the right steps in terms of, here's my introduction, here's the different points that I want to make, and in the end, here's my conclusion, or whatever the content is of your paper, but make sure it has a logical flow to it, so that it sort of makes sense easily as we go through and read it. An appendix can be used if you have extra things that you're including, if you have just a list of your data maybe, or if you've done research, you've done original research and you ran a survey, you might want to include the survey in the appendix. But you always want to make sure that the appendix is mentioned within your paper. So if you have an appendix and say you're in the part of your paper where you're discussing your research methods, I teach research methods, so I see this a lot. Make sure that you mention, well, we used a survey, and here's all the details about the survey that we used. The entire survey is available in the appendix, so that we know that it's there, and so it's not just sort of sticking there, and we don't really know what it belongs to. So the point of all this is to not make your professor work hard to understand you. And we're not saying this because professors are dumb. We're saying this because readability is a very important part of writing. So you want your professor to be able to understand your points without having to go through long paragraphs and things that are not well organized, because then it takes us much longer to read the paper, and that may affect your grade in the end. So make sure that you've created things that are logical and flow well and are organized well to make it easy for us to read, and we can just focus on the content and the points that you have to make rather than getting through all of those details that make it hard to read. So to help with this, APA provides guidance for headings, and headings can help separate your paper and the levels of importance in your paper. So this again is taken from the Ashford Writing Center's website, and they've talked about 5 levels of headings, and they give the guidelines for each type of heading. So level 1 is sort of the highest level of your heading. That might be for like the major points of your paper. If you have an introduction and you have literature review, and then you have research methods, and then you have findings and discussion and conclusion. Those are kind of your 5-level headings. Second level headings and all the way down through 5 are where they get more focused, so that under your first level heading you might have a literature review as a level 1 heading. And then level 2 might be the different points or the different types of research that you're including in your literature review. And so each of those different kinds of points under level 1 will be your level 2 heading. So here's an example of how these headings are used if we had sort of a basic layout of the paper. So right here, they're giving an example again on the Ashford Writing Center website about distance learning education and tools used in distance learning. So our top levels are asynchronous communication, synchronous delivery tools, blended learning systems, and discussion. So they've got, on their top levels, they have 3 different kinds of tools and communication systems that they're discussing, and then some discussion at the end. And for the level 2 and below headings, they've got more details. The level 2 headings are points about asynchronous communication in the first part. And then they've got level 3 headings, which goes under one of the level 2 headings. We've got additional points there about improving asynchronous communication. So using these headings and using them correctly at the right levels to make it much easier to follow your paper, because if you've highlighted those points, it's easier to scan through the paper, see what you've covered, and then as you're reading the headings and you're reading the paper, you know then, okay, well this section is about synchronous delivery tools, and here's the different points under that. So once again, that makes it more organized and easier for everyone to read. The next step in the model, and we're getting there at this point, is citing. Citing is important. I cannot emphasize how important this is and how frequently I see problems with citations in students' papers and how easy it is to lose points here. Fail to cite your sources properly constitutes plagiarism. A plagiarism accusation has negative consequences for your academic future. I'm saying this from an Ashford University professor's perspective, but all universities, I believe, have rules about plagiarism. If you don't cite your sources properly, then you can be accused of academic dishonesty at Ashford University, which will mean, in that case, if you get reported to the university, first you might get a warning and so on if it's been determined that some sort of plagiarism has occurred. But it can escalate into, you might get a 0 for the paper, you might get a 0 eventually for a course, and if it keeps going and you create a pattern of this, then you could be expelled from the university. So we want to make sure that this doesn't happen to you. I'm on the committee that reviews these kinds of things, and I can tell you, first-hand knowledge, it can happen. And even if you don't think that you know that you're supposed to do it, it doesn't matter. If you're still caught, then your professor can still report you, and you can still get in trouble for it. So to avoid those horrible consequences, make sure that you are doing things like citing things, but writing things up in your own words as much as possible. So what you want to do is sort of rewrite things. If you read something, write it up, and then put your citation at the end so you have your in-text citation. But put things in your own words. If you don't use your own words and you're using the words that are directly there in the paper, you need to put that in quotation marks. Use that only in certain cases. I see frequently a lot of students using far too many direct quotes, and then I start to wonder if they're really understanding what they've read or if they're just putting things down because they read it and it's easier to quote it rather than writing it themselves. So according to APA, and according to my opinion, I agree with this, you should only use quotes when the quote is written very powerfully and you can't find another way to say it yourself and you just like, I just love these words, I want to use these words in my paper. Or when it really strongly supports your argument, like they said something that's exactly on target with the point that you're trying to make and you want to use those words because they help you so much. When you do that, make sure that you put quotation marks around the quote if it's less than 40 words. If it's more than 40 words, it should be presented as a block quotation, and I'll show an example of that in a minute. And again, don't try to use quotes to try to avoid understanding the material because it's easy to just say, oh, well, I'm just going to quote this part of this book because it sounds like it's on my topic and I don't really want to try to understand it or I don't want to take the time to rewrite it. That makes you look very unprofessional. And so I strongly advise against that. So work as hard as you can to put as much as you, explain as much as you can in your own words, but then provide the citation to say that, well, this is where I got the idea from so that it doesn't look like you're stealing somebody else's ideas, and then that can get you into those plagiarism issues. So your reference list at the end, you need to include that at the end of your paper, the title references at the top, and you have one list for the entire paper. Make sure that it's all at the end and that they are listed alphabetically by author. Hanging indent means that the second line and every subsequent line of that particular citation is indented by ½ inch. So this is the opposite of a paragraph, where in a paragraph you indent the first line of a paragraph. In your reference list, you do the opposite, where the first line is at the edge of the left margin, and then everything else is indented 5 spaces. And so they are double spaced, just like the rest of your paper. And I won't get too much into formatting references because we could do a whole series of APA talks just based on formatting references. And Dr. Swanson and others and I have done some of this in the past. So I won't go into too much about citing or referencing in APA format today, but there are some examples here for you, and there's lots of help available if you need some assistance in making sure the formatting is correct. What I will say is that a lot of times students don't understand they did something wrong with APA formatting, and they don't understand necessarily how specific the guidelines are, so that, you know, if you have put in their entire first name rather than the first initial, officially that's against APA formatting. I also see things like they will capitalize every title of a book title, every word in a book title. Again, you know, in book titles, for example, you only capitalize the first word of the title, any proper nouns, and the first word after a colon in a title. Other than that, it's all lowercase. So those kinds of things can make your APA formatting, if you're correct, if that's an important thing to your professors. So make sure that you're very careful with formatting these references correctly, because again, you can lose points there. So here are some examples of citations and how they can appear in your paper. So let's make up, I made up this article, but I'm going to pretend I wrote and published this article this year. And I'm trying to paraphrase something that was written. And what I said here is Pennington 2014. Well, that is saying, well, here's my in-text citation. It's from Pennington 2014. Emphasize the importance of increasing the visibility of nonprofit organizations using social media. So that's not exactly what Pennington said, but I put it in my own words, but I still have to credit her because it was her idea and it was in her paper. So that's the paraphrase, summarized version of an in-text citation. A direct quote is where I said, oh, I love the way she said this. I need to include this. So nonprofits should consider hiring search engine optimization experts. So I've directly quoted what she said. So we've got Pennington 2014, page 72. That's another place where I see a lot of issues. There are spaces between those commas, but I think the font isn't making it show up very well. When you have the page number in APA, you put P, period, space, 72. I see a lot of variations on this in students' papers. Sometimes I'll see PG, period. Sometimes I'll see P, period, 72 without the space after the period. A lot of variations on that. So just make sure that you have followed that format specifically. So I have cited Pennington in my text. That means I have to list it in the references list at the end. So there's her journal article, first initials, Pennington DM, year 2014. The article title is there without capital letters in everything. It's not in italics. In journal titles, you have to italicize the journal name and put everything, every important word with a capital letter, comma, and then the volume number, the issue number in parentheses, comma, space, and then the pages of the journal article. So again, there's very specific things, and a lot of times students will miss those little details, but it does make the citation APA formatted correctly if we follow those picky details. Here's an example of a block quotation, and what this is showing you here is how it looks when basically they've quoted something that is longer than 40 words. In the chapter Chicken Man, McBride narrated his rebellion as a teenager with honesty but without remorse. And a block quotation is single-spaced. It's pretty much the only place in an APA formatted paper where you will single-space something. And this doesn't show it correctly, actually, but a block quotation needs to be indented from the rest of the text a few spaces. So it should be over about a half an inch, formatted from the regular paper is on the left side, and it's single-spaced, and you also have to include the page number at the end. So we are at the end. We have done the P, L, O, and the C. Now we have to do the E, which is edit. So what we need to do is edit for, I'm going to say, content readability and clarity. Frequently, I think that a lot of students skip this step, maybe because they don't have time at the end or because they might not realize that all writing needs editing. It doesn't matter how good you write your earlier drafts. It all needs to be edited at the end to make sure you haven't skipped words or used incorrect words, things like that. So here's a few tips to try to edit it as much as you can. One thing is to read it to yourself out loud. And sometimes we say things and it sounds correct in spoken English, but we might write it differently if we're not being careful. And typically, written English is more formal than spoken English, especially for something like an academic paper. So read it to yourself out loud. If things sound strange to you as you read it word for word, be careful to pay attention to how it sounds. If it doesn't sound right, then you need to change it. sometimes you need somebody else to read it because you spent so many hours in this paper and you don't want to look at it anymore and you're too close to it, so you need somebody to come in and read it for you. So you might want to ask somebody else in your house or something to just look at it and don't ask them to change the content, but just say, hey, does this sound good to you? Did I miss anything obvious? When you're doing it or when somebody else is doing it, read it and decide if something else, is anything that makes sense? Does it all make sense? Does it sound a little strange here and there? Is the flow good? So those logical points, is it presented logically? Do the sections go well together? Do all the headings make sense where they are? And have you made sure that everything that you wanted to say is in there, because you might have forgotten some points that you wanted to make that you missed out on in the process of writing the paper. So keep revising until you're sick of it. And kind of once you know, I've looked at this so much I can't stand to look at it anymore, then you're probably as close to done as you're going to get. Proofread, 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 proofread. I can't emphasize this point enough. I teach graduate students here at Ashford for the most part, and I still see proofreading issues all the time, and you will lose points if things are not written and proofread and cleaned up. So when students don't like this, sometimes they will tell me, it's not an English class. No, it's not an English class, it's a business class, but your writing is what conveys your professionalism. When it's on paper, your colleagues, your bosses, everybody will be looking at how you're writing, and you need to make sure that it's written as well as possible, because if it's full of silly grammatical issues and spelling errors and things that you could have fixed, then your professionalism and how they judge you as a professional might not be judged as well as it would be if these things were cleaned up. So I see a lot of really simple things that can be fixed easily. I see things like employees is important rather than employees are important. Your versus YOU apostrophe RE, there, and there. I see those things frequently. So all these little grammatical issues that we should be able to do better with as university students. So we need to really make sure that we're going through our papers to make sure that these things are cleaned up a little bit better. So now I have a little editing exercise for you. I have put in here some things that need editing, and if you can type into chat and start it, see if you can pick out the things that need fixed. So let's start with the first bullet point here. What do you see wrong with the first one? Do we have any input on this? Okay, it doesn't look like anybody's wanting to jump into it at this point, but so what we want to say is the conclusions are made by combining this conclusion, and that's the first thing. Something else that I would suggest is not to use the same word twice in the same sentence. So, and also we should say these conclusions instead of this conclusion, because apparently we're talking about multiple conclusions here, whatever they are. I don't know. I made up the sentence. So you could change this to the conclusions are made by combining these, or make it so that you don't use conclusion twice. So try to reword that a little bit. The conclusions are made by combining them. And even still, that's still not a very good sentence. Do you see what I'm saying? It still sounds a little bit awkward, a little bit clunky. So try to find a better way to say that instead of sort of repeating yourself there. Try the next one. If you have good customer service, you're going to increase company's profits. Anyone see what's wrong with this stuff? This sentence. What's going on here is, first of all, the Y-O-U-R should be Y-O-U apostrophe R-E. And instead of saying company's profits, you should say your company's profits or the company's profits, and companies should be apostrophe S. I am, okay. You are, right, so that's one thing to fix. And you also might want to think about in APA formatting, if you have this kind of a sentence structure, using you is maybe not necessarily the best approach. You might want to make it sound a little bit more impersonal so that you're not using you, because it's kind of a vague word to use in formal academic writing. The internet in my OPION is great because the sites like Goggle and other sites, you can find anything you need at a true rotation in today's world. There's a lot of things wrong with this sentence. Can somebody point out a few of them? Well, the first one, the most obvious one to me, is that OPION should be opinions. And we need to have commas. If we're going to say my opinion, you need to surround that with commas because they would be their natural speaking. Goggle should be Google. And saying you can find anything you need at the true rotation. Well, rotation should be something like revolutions. It's also a run-on sentence because we've combined multiple sentences into one sentence. And today's world should be today 'S. In a workplace, it is very important to have clear, concise, and accurate information, and that information is communicated to the appropriate individuals as needed, as time appropriately as possible. So this is a sentence that one of my colleagues read from one of her students' papers, so this is an actual thing that was posted. What's confusing about this sentence? Do you have any opinions on this one? Well, for a couple of things, there's a few things wrong with the sentence. One is that communicate should be communicated. Time appropriately should be time appropriate. And also, it's sort of just a very wordy sentence in the sense that it's used information twice as a word. Saying that twice in a row is a little bit awkward. So we can sort of shorten the sentence up a little bit and get rid of some of those extra words. Clear up things like communicated and appropriate so that those things are grammatically correct. And the sentence could be quite a bit shorter if we take out all the extra words. Search engine are appropriate for the internet. Pennington, 2014, page 32. So with this one, it should be search engines are important. So that we need to have engines instead of engines so that we have appropriate subject-verb agreement. Yes. Pennington 2014, page 32. Well, in APA, we need to have a comma after Pennington and after 2014. And page 32, PG should be P so that it's not PG in APA. Right. So that's just an example of some sentences that in some cases have been taken from actual student papers, and in some cases I've written a couple of these just based on the writing that I see frequently from my students. And these are the kinds of things that we need to look out for when we're writing our final papers and make sure that we have edited them so that in the end we can avoid these kinds of errors because it will make it easier for your professor to read your paper, and it will make you seem more professional, more confident if we can clean up and have a little bit better writing. So I've included a link there to a blog that is a very interesting thing to read. Professors will anonymously send in sentences that their students have written, and they get posted on the blog, so you don't ever know the student's name or the professor's name or where they're from. But if you read it, there's some really interesting examples of students writing and ideas on there. So if you want to some laughs, because it is pretty funny to read some of their sentences or just get some more practice, take a look at that site and you'll probably end up spending some time on there reading things. It's a lot of fun. So after you've gotten through those 5 steps of the model, which are, if you remember them, starting with plan and proceeding through all of those different things, right? Those 5 steps I gave you. And if you're in an online course, make sure that when you send your submission in that you are sending it correctly, because a lot of times what will happen is the student will send in a paper, something happened with the internet, it didn't get submitted correctly, and then the professor doesn't see the paper in there and the student gets a 0 because the paper isn't there. Make sure that you double check to make sure that the paper got submitted correctly and that the file is actually there. So you've gone through your 5 steps. You double check for the submission, and then you can do as my girls do and sleep. My girls get to sleep all the time because they don't need to write papers, they don't need to grade papers. So I do this frequently, and well, they do it frequently. I work at home, and so a lot of times I will see them sleeping while I am up reading papers or writing papers of my own, and they get to do this all day long. But if your final paper is done and you submit it on time, then you get to do what they do and take a long sleep break before you get up and hit your next paper or whatever follows after that. So here are a few resources for you to take a look at. The APA manuals are always important to have. So the 2010 6th edition of the APA publication manual is still the most recent version. 2012, they released an APA style guide to electronic references, and that one is only available electronically, so you can get it in Kindle format or a PDF format. And the websites that I've listed up there at the top are either all from APA, because there are a lot of sites on the internet that claim to have accurate APA style. And frequently, I look at those things like sites from Purdue and so on, and they actually have provided incorrect information. So I prefer to go directly to APA when I need help. So the APA style blog is at blog.apastyle.org, and that's got all kinds of posts with all kinds of help for you. APA Style also has a Facebook page and a Twitter account, so you can follow them on social media if you're on that. The APAstyle.org tutorial will actually take you through a series of slides to give you more information about things that is covered in this talk, as well as more information about reference formatting. And then the sites.google.com site is a link to all of the presentations that have been created so far and archived in this APA&Beyond series of webinars, and so you can link to everything that we've done so far in the series from that site. And Dr. Swanson and I at least like to think that they're very helpful, and so we're hoping that we can continue to do these webinars and archive them and have a nice set of references for students to follow and faculty to follow when they need to brush up on their APA style. So thank you. Do you have any questions? Yes, the site will be in the APA Dropbox, and we will also link to it on that Google site once the students have a chance to get it archived and posted. Do you have any questions? Thanks for your feedback. Appreciate that. Any questions about the content or any comments or anything else I can help with before we conclude here? You have a great evening too. Okay, great. Well, I hope this was helpful, and I hope that it helps people in the future to come as they find this stuff and need some help with writing their final papers. Thanks. You have a good evening too, and have a good night. Thanks a lot.